Have you ever stopped to think about how bad decisions, even if they seem small, can lead us down dark paths full of pain and regret? The story of Lot is one of those biblical stories that leaves us in shock, not only because of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, but also because of an episode that is difficult to even mention: incest with his own daughters. But was everything as simple as it seems? Was Lot just a victim of fate? Or did his choices open the door to chaos? In this video, we'll dive deep into one of the most controversial and intense passages in the entire Bible. Let's understand why Lot decided to live in Sodom, what the angels did in that city taken by sin, how divine justice acted without mercy, and what all this has to do with faith, free will, and our final judgment. You will discover how a man who walked with Abraham ended up isolated in a cave, involved in a plot of desperation and survival that resulted in the birth of the Moabites and Ammonites. Lot's life was not simple. Surrounded by difficult moral choices, his journey reveals how disobedience and attachment to the world can blind us to what God really wants to do in us. And most impressively, even in the midst of chaos, there are still lessons of faith and hope. Lot's story serves as a mirror for us to reflect on what we are building and where our decisions are taking us. So if you've ever wondered how God deals with extreme sin, what the Bible says about mercy even in the worst-case scenarios, or why Lot's daughters took such a shocking action, stick with me until the end. I promise that your view of Genesis and your own spiritual walk will never be the same. If you believe that more people need to hear about the Word of God, like and subscribe to the channel. Every click of yours is a seed that can transform lives. Help this video reach hearts thirsty for truth. The world in which Lot lived was a scene filled with darkness. In Genesis, we find descriptions of cities like Sodom and Gomorrah plunged into a spiral of moral degradation. Sin there was not an isolated occurrence, it was a way of life. Lust, violence, and injustice dominated human relationships. Men and women lived as if God did not exist, and the result was a society without limits, where even the angels sent by God were the target of perverse desires. The Bible clearly shows that this was not just a case of social decline, but a direct confrontation with divine justice. Sodom became the symbol of a people who defied the Creator himself with their practices. Centuries later, the Apostle Peter would say that Lot was a righteous man who was distressed day after day when he saw what was happening around him. It was a silent cry for mercy in the midst of chaos. But how long would God allow such an affront to continue without judging? The presence of the angels marks a turning point in the narrative. They descend into the city with a clear purpose: to verify the outcry that had risen to the heavens because of the wickedness of the people. And it is here that the spiritual scenario takes on even more serious contours. What was merely human depravity turns into a heavenly crisis. The angels are attacked, and the behavior of the inhabitants reveals how far Sodom had already surpassed any limit of redemption. The environment is so corrupt that even family ties are affected. Later, the story culminates in an episode of incest, a cruel reflection of the distortion of values that contaminated even those who escaped destruction. The cave where Lot hides with his daughters is not only a physical refuge, but a symbol of how human beings can isolate themselves in spiritual darkness after mistaken moral choices. It is the ultimate portrait of a world that ignored God's warnings. And the most impressive thing, even in the midst of so much judgment, mercy still shines through. The angels don't just come to destroy, they also come to rescue. Lot is lifted out by the hand. God, in his compassion, does not ignore the righteous in the midst of the wicked. And this raises a powerful question. Have we been like Sodom or like Lot, trying to survive with faith in a world headed toward judgment? Lot's story begins in Genesis 11, amidst the genealogies of the patriarchs. He was the nephew of Abraham, the great man of faith, and lived in a time when family ties were essential for survival. After the death of his father, Haran, Lot joined his uncle on a journey that would change their lives. Together, they left Ur of the Chaldees for the land of Canaan, answering God's call to Abraham. From an early age, we see that Lot was immersed in a context of faith and promise. But as we will see, being close to the promise does not always mean living within God's will. During the journey, hunger forces the two to seek shelter in Egypt. There they experience a tense episode. Abraham, out of fear, lies and says that Sarah is his sister. Despite his mistake, God intervenes with mercy and saves them from danger. Lot witnesses all of this. He sees God protecting, guiding, and correcting him. And even though we don't know many details about his personal faith at that time, we know that he was following in the footsteps of someone chosen. This detail is important. Lot grows up seeing God's faithfulness in action, but time will reveal whether he will learn to trust in the same way. After leaving Egypt, they returned to the Promised Land. But as the herds and possessions grew, friction arose between Abraham's shepherds and Lot's. Blessings became a cause for division. Abraham, in a noble gesture, offers Lot the opportunity to first choose where he would like to live. And here, once again, the Bible shows us the value of free will. Lot looks up and chooses the fertile plain of the Jordan near Sodom. The land was good to the eyes, but it carried a deep spiritual risk. This seemingly strategic choice becomes a turning point in Lot's journey. While Abraham remains in the high places, further away from corruption, Lot moves closer to the cities dominated by sin. His decision reflects the dilemma that many face to this day: to follow the path that is most comfortable and advantageous in the eyes of man, or to trust in what God proposes, even if it seems more difficult. The problem was not the choice itself, but the criteria that Lot used. He prioritized appearance, productivity, stability, and ignored the spiritual influence of the environment. And so, Lot enters a territory where good and evil are confused. Even though he didn't fully know what awaited him, he became part of a scenario that would put him to the test. From then on, his story ceases to be just a walk alongside Abraham and becomes a living portrait of the consequences of our decisions. As modern disciples, we need to ask, are we walking by faith or by appearances? Because the place where we choose to live, work, or socialize can shape our eternity. God's blessing on Abraham and Lot was evident. They both prospered so much that the land could no longer support them both. Their flocks and herds multiplied, as did their servants, and their fields began to grow too small for their wealth. Ironically, success created friction. Lot's herdsmen began to argue with Abraham's herdsmen, revealing that even prosperity can be a test of character. When not handled wisely and humbly, it becomes an occasion for conflict. Abraham, with the peace-loving heart that has always characterized him, takes the initiative. He does not wait for the situation to get worse. He calls Lot for a frank conversation and generously proposes separation. He says, "If you go to the left, I will go to the right." It is at this moment that Lot's free will once again comes into play. He does not consult God, nor does he ask his uncle for advice. He simply analyzes with his natural eyes. And what does he see? A green, fertile, promising land. Exactly the kind of environment that attracts those who only think about material growth. But this fertile land had a name: Sodom. A place known not only for its beauty, but for its wickedness. The Bible is clear. The men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. Lot ignores this detail. His choice reveals a dangerous mindset, that of someone who prefers to live with sin in exchange for comfort. The decision seemed smart, strategic, but from the perspective of the kingdom, it was a step in the wrong direction. Separation from Abraham marked the beginning of Lot's moral decline, even if he did not realize it at first. While Lot heads for the plains of the Jordan, Abraham remains where God has placed him. It is interesting to note how Abraham's silent obedience contrasts with Lot's silent ambition. Abraham was less concerned with wealth and more attentive to the voice of God. And this contrast between the 2 points to 2 ways of living, one centered on faith, the other on appearances. Lot chose ease, but Abraham chose faithfulness. And in the long run, this difference would become dramatically visible. The moral choices we make, especially in times of prosperity, reveal much about our hearts. When things are going well, we tend to rely on our own vision, forgetting that true wisdom comes from above. Lot was not a bad man, but he was unwise. He let greed override prudence, and the promise that surrounded him took a back seat. The separation was physical, but it was also spiritual. From that point on, Lot distanced himself not only from Abraham, but from the covering of God that came with him. Soon after the separation, Lot did not just move closer to Sodom, he settled there. What seemed like a strategic decision ended up immersing him deeply in a corrupt culture. In time, Lot rose from an outsider to an influential figure within the city, possibly even serving as a local judge. However, this social position came at a high spiritual price. He watched daily the moral degradation of Sodom and Gomorrah, and his righteous soul, as Peter says, was deeply distressed. Sodom was more than just a bad city. It was a living portrait of inverted values. Sin was not hidden, but celebrated. Distorted relationships, injustice, violence, and a complete lack of fear of God dominated the environment. Living with all of this on a daily basis inevitably affected Lot's outlook. Even though he tried to maintain his faith, the city's influence began to shape his perception. It's like someone living in a toxic environment, trying not to be contaminated, but without completely distancing themselves from it. This scenario reveals a spiritual tension that many people still experience today. Lot, despite being uncomfortable, remained in Sodom, perhaps for convenience, status, or even hope for change. But how long can we resist in an environment that constantly pulls us away from God? Lot's stay shows how much our moral choices need to be accompanied by practical decisions. It is no use just lamenting the sin around us. At some point, we need to move away from it. Lot's family also began to reflect the effects of this continued exposure. His daughters grew up in that distorted environment, and his wife seems to have developed a deep attachment to the city. This becomes clear later on when she looks back and is transformed into a pillar of salt. Prolonged coexistence with wickedness does not go unnoticed. Lot's faith may have held up, but his home had already been stained. This is the warning that Genesis leaves us. The environment shapes the heart, even when we try to resist in silence. Even though Lot was not like the Sodomites, he lived among them, and this made him vulnerable. The morality of Sodom was slowly undermining his values, distorting his priorities. He tried to balance faith and convenience, but that kind of balance rarely works. This phase of Lot's life invites us to reflect. How much have we allowed the world to shape our way of thinking? Are we, like Lot, trying to survive spiritually, in a place where sin is the rule? Not everything in Sodom was glamorous and prosperous. At a certain point, a coalition of Mesopotamian kings rose up against Sodom and other cities in the region. The situation turned into war, and Lot ended up in the middle of the conflict. When the invading kings won, they sacked Sodom and took Lot prisoner, along with all his possessions. The decision to live near sin now exacted a high price. He reaped, even without intending to, the consequences of the corruption that surrounded him. But it is in this moment of crisis that Abraham's faithfulness shines. Upon learning of what had happened, he gathers 318 trained servants and sets out on a courageous nighttime rescue. There was no guarantee of victory, but there was a sense of mission. Lot could have chosen another path, but he was still family. And even though he had walked away, Abraham did not abandon him. This attitude speaks of intercession, of love that goes beyond mistakes, and of the willingness to fight for those we love, even when our choices put them in danger. The rescue is successful. Abraham defeats the invading kings, recovers the plundered goods, and frees Lot and his family. It is an act of bravery, but also a gesture of mercy, almost a foretaste of what God would do later with angels, rescuing Lot from Sodom. Soon after the rescue, an unexpected encounter occurs. Abraham meets with Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. He offers bread and wine and blesses Abraham. This episode points to a higher priesthood full of prophetic symbolism. Lot, in turn, returns to Sodom. Yes, he does. Even after the war, even after the rescue, even with clear signs that that place was unstable and dangerous. It is difficult to understand, but the truth is that attachment to old comfort zones often speaks louder than God's warnings. How many times, even after deliverances and signs, do we insist on returning to what is hurting us? Lot shows how resistance to change can keep us trapped in cycles of suffering. This episode reinforces that rescue does not always guarantee transformation. Lot was saved physically, but his mindset was still rooted in Sodom. God's mercy manifests itself in many ways, through people, circumstances, even wars, but the final answer is always ours. Free will remains. And in Lot's case, he had not yet understood that certain environments are not only dangerous, they are spiritually lethal. And what comes next would prove it with fire from heaven. God does not act without warning. Before executing judgment on Sodom, he sends 2 angels to the city, but before that they pass by Abraham. It is there that the heavenly plan begins to unfold. Abraham, in his tent, receives the visitors with hospitality and reverence. God shares with him what is about to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah. It is a moment of revelation and also of testing. The Creator invites the patriarch to participate spiritually in what is to come next. As the angels make their way to Sodom, Lot greets them at the city gates. He recognizes that there is something different about them and insists that they stay at his house. His attitude shows that, despite the environment that surrounded him, he still has a sense of righteousness and fear. However, the city does not take this lying down. Soon, men from Sodom surround the house, demanding that Lot hand over the visitors so that they can abuse them. An absurd scene that reveals the degree of perversity into which that society had sunk. In the midst of his desperation, Lot tries to protect the angels and takes an unthinkable step. He offers his own daughters. This decision reveals how much his vision was distorted by his surroundings. He still wanted to do good, but he could no longer tell right from wrong. This part of the story is hard and real. It shows how living in sin can affect even the deepest values. Lot wanted to protect the angels, but he would sacrifice his family in the process. When sin is normalized, discernment disappears. The divine response comes soon after. The angels intervene directly. They blind the attackers, expose the urgency of the coming destruction, and instruct Lot to gather his family. Divine justice could wait no longer. Sodom had crossed all lines. God does not destroy on impulse. He acts after opportunities, warnings, and intercessions. But when evil is complete and irremediable, judgment comes as a just response. This visit was not a simple check. It was the harbinger of the end. Even in the face of the gravity of the situation, Lot hesitates. He warns his sons-in-law, but they scoff. His family authority has already been compromised. And here we learn something precious. Living in sin without confronting it can make us spiritually irrelevant. When the moment of truth arrives, no one believes our voice anymore. The angels were there urgently, but Lot's house was still trapped in the city. Time was running out, and the choice between staying or fleeing now became a matter of life or death. Before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, one of the most moving moments in the entire Bible occurs: the intercession of Abraham. When God reveals his plan of judgment, Abraham does not remain indifferent. He stands up as an intercessor, one who stands between God and men, crying out for mercy. His plea begins with courage and respect. Will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? It is a cry that reveals love, compassion, and the boldness that only comes from an intimate relationship with God. Abraham begins by asking that if there were 50 righteous people, God would spare the city. And when God agrees, Abraham continues 45, 40, 30, 20, until he reaches 10. It is as if each number is a note in a melody of mercy. The patriarch does not give up easily. He persists with humility and faith, believing that God's character is just and compassionate. This sequence of requests shows that sincere prayer can move the heart of God, even in the face of the most revolting sin. Abraham's intercession is also a portrait of the heart of Christ. Like Lot's uncle, Jesus intercedes for us, even when we are mired in bad decisions. He pleads not for immediate justice, but for an opportunity to repent. Abraham knew that Sodom deserved judgment, but he still sought a loophole for mercy. This teaches us that we should not rejoice in the downfall of the wicked, but rather pray that they will find the light before it is too late. Unfortunately, Sodom did not have even 10 righteous people. The city had become completely corrupt, but Abraham's intercession was not in vain. God heard, considered, and acted on this dialogue. It is because of this intercession that Lot, even in his spiritual confusion, is ultimately spared. This reveals a powerful principle. The prayer of a righteous person can reach people who are no longer even hearing God's voice. The effect of prayer goes beyond what we see. It moves heaven and destinies. This part of the story invites us to be more than observers of the evil around us. It calls us to be intercessors. Who in your family needs someone who will pray boldly like Abraham? Instead of judging or giving up, how about crying out for mercy? Divine justice is real, but intercession can make room for miracles. May our hearts, like Abraham's, be more focused on saving than condemning. And may we never forget there is still time to intercede for those we love. The moment arrives when divine justice can wait no longer. The angels, already in Lot's house, announce that the city will be destroyed. There is no more time for negotiations. They advise Lot to gather his wife, daughters, and sons-in-law and flee immediately. But even in the face of heavenly warning, Lot hesitates. It is a scene that reveals how sin can take root in our souls, making it difficult even to obey in the face of imminent danger. Lot's sons-in-law think he is joking. His influence as a spiritual man has been lost over time. This unbelief shows us how living in close proximity to sin can neutralize our spiritual authority. When spiritual urgency knocks on the door, many fail to listen, not for lack of warning, but for lack of credibility. Then the angels take Lot, his wife and his daughters by the hand and drag them out. Yes, that's right. They had to be dragged out by force. As they flee, the angels give clear instructions. Do not look back. But in the midst of their rush, Lot's wife disobeys. She looks back and in that instant turns into a pillar of salt. A gesture that seems small, but it reveals a heart still attached to what was left behind. The destruction of Sodom is complete. Fire and brimstone descend from the sky and consume everything. But what hurts most in this scene is not the end of the city. It is the attachment to the past that prevented the full salvation of those who were already on the way. The figure of Lot's wife is a warning to all of us. It is not enough to leave the environment of sin. Sin must also leave us. Many times we want to continue with God, but we still miss what we left behind. Looking back can be symbolic of so many things: addictions, toxic relationships, old lifestyles. The problem is not in running away from destruction, but in continuing to desire what God has already sentenced as death. Despite the tragedy, Lot survives, but the emotional price is high. He leaves with his daughters, without his wife, without his sons-in-law, without his possessions. He escaped by mercy, not by merit. And here is an uncomfortable truth. God rescues us even when we do not deserve it. But that does not exempt us from the consequences. The destruction of Sodom is God's cry against institutionalized sin, and Lot's escape reminds us that salvation requires renunciation, haste, and a heart determined not to look back. After fleeing the destruction of Sodom, Lot takes refuge in a small town called Zoar, but soon abandons it in fear. He climbs into the mountains and hides in a cave with his 2 daughters. It is at this point that the story takes a disturbing turn. This man who once had flocks, servants, and social status now lives in isolation, in total seclusion. The silence of the cave contrasts with the clamor of the destroyed city. And it is in this somber scenario that his daughters make a drastic decision. The young women, believing they were the last survivors on Earth, hatch a plan to preserve the family line. They get their father drunk and sleep with him on different nights without Lot realizing what is happening. The Bible tells this story without embellishment, showing the gravity of the act. It is an episode of incest, yes, but it is also the result of years of living in a culture where right and wrong have been corrupted. Lot's daughters act out of desperation, but also out of the influence of Sodom, which was still alive in them. From this relationship, 2 sons were born, Moab and Ben-Ammi, who became the patriarchs of the Moabite and Ammonite nations. Both nations would later oppose Israel, bringing conflict, idolatry, and spiritual deviation. The harvest of Sodom's decline continues for generations. What began as a choice for fertile land ends with a legacy of tension and pain. This part of the story is hard to read, but essential to understanding how sin leaves deep and lasting marks, even when we think we have escaped it. Lot, even though physically saved, ends his journey in complete spiritual solitude. The cave where he hides has become a tomb of dreams, and his daughters, fruits of the culture he allowed to surround them. He had left Sodom, but Sodom had not left his home. This family tragedy reminds us that it is not enough to flee from sin. We must be restored internally. Without healing, even the new beginning can be corrupted. And without discernment, we can create new generations wounded by our past decisions. God's silence in this part of the story also teaches us something. Heaven does not always cry out when we make mistakes, but the echo of our choices speaks loudly. The mercy that saved Lot from destruction did not prevent him from suffering the consequences of a life without spiritual direction. Seclusion and incest were not direct divine punishments, but the result of accumulated decisions. The legacy left by Lot challenges us. What kind of spiritual inheritance are we building for those who come after us? Lot's story doesn't end with great victories or celebrations. It ends with a warning. Lot is remembered in the New Testament, especially in 2 Peter 2:7-8, as a righteous man who suffered from the wickedness around him. Yet his journey is marked by fragile choices, decisions based on appearance, and a faith that wavered under pressure. This doesn't make him a villain, just human, and perhaps that's exactly why his story resonates so strongly with us. It's deeply real. Lot lived among spiritual giants like Abraham, witnessed miracles, was visited by angels, and yet ended his days in a cave, surrounded by painful consequences. This story reminds us that it is not enough to be around those who have faith. We must develop our own. Salvation is personal, and obedience cannot be borrowed. Every decision we make, where to live, who to hang out with, what to tolerate, is shaping our spiritual destiny. Free will is a gift, but it is also a responsibility. Lot's wife, transformed into a pillar of salt, symbolizes those who want to follow God but cannot let go of the past. Lot's daughters, marked by Sodom, show how the surrounding culture can affect even the most innocent. And Lot, hesitant, indecisive, saved by mercy, is the portrait of the believer who tries to balance the kingdom of God with the comforts of the world. It is not a happy ending, but it is an ending that teaches us to take faith seriously. Moral choices are not neutral. They sow the seeds of tomorrow. Divine justice was powerfully manifested in Sodom, but it was preceded by mercy, intercession, and warning. God does not destroy for pleasure. He seeks to save until the last moment. Delay in judgment is in fact divine patience, but when ignored, it turns into a fire that purifies evil. The last judgment, mentioned so many times in the Bible, echoes this truth. There will be an end, but before it, God extends his hand. Lot grabbed that hand, but many around him scoffed, hesitated, or simply looked back. What kind of person do you want to be when faced with God's calling? The one who hesitates, who looks back, or the one who runs with faith, even if she loses everything along the way? Lot's journey is full of failures, but also warnings that protect us. God does not hide the fragility of his characters because it is in this raw truth that he invites us to transformation. And if we are still alive to reflect on this, it is because he, in his mercy, is giving us one more chance to make different choices. Lot's journey is like a mirror that forces us to face difficult questions. To what extent are we allowing the world to dictate our decisions? Have our choices been guided by faith or by convenience? Living close to the promise, as Lot lived with Abraham, does not guarantee spiritual maturity. It is necessary to cultivate a direct relationship with God, without outsourcing faith, without negotiating values. Because in the end, each one will be responsible for his or her own journey before the final judgment. Lot was not condemned for living in Sodom, but rather for the compromises he made there. The environment around us may be corrupt, but it is up to us to decide whether we will allow it to corrupt our inner selves. His story reminds us that God's mercy is real, deep, and accessible, but it does not cancel out the consequences of wrong choices. The Lord is still just, and that is why today he still gives us the chance to choose life. What about you? Have you been looking back too much? Are you hesitating when faced with God's voice? Or have you been hiding in emotional caves, trying to survive the chaos around you? Perhaps this story has touched deep wounds or turned on lights in forgotten areas of your soul. And that's good. It means the Spirit is blowing, calling, warning you. Don't ignore this call. There is still time to get out of Sodom. There is still time to make new choices. Use this story as a starting point. Reflect on what God is asking of you. Maybe it's time to leave places where your faith is being diluted. Maybe it's time to resume a life of prayer, to take a moral stand, to return to obedience. Don't wait until you lose everything to understand the value of God's presence. The word was given to us to prepare us, and today Lot is crying out through Scripture, "Choose better than I have chosen." If this message spoke to you, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Comment below, "I choose to obey God." This helps a lot to spread the word and touch other hearts that are also looking for direction. Let's build together a generation that does not conform to this world, but is transformed by the renewing of the mind, as Romans 12:2 teaches.